Good morning, all. Thank you all for joining us for today's webinar. This is our last webinar in Child Development Webinar Series 2022. Thank you all once again for your lovable support for making this series successful. Today's topic is the environment-based intervention approach to promote inclusion at home, school, and community. I would like to introduce our two speakers, Brien and Navamani. Brien is a researcher based in Canada. She is Associate Research and Capacity Building Director for the Enabling Inclusion Program at Amar Seva Sangam. She has presented many international conferences and published in peer-reviewed journals. Welcome, ma'am. And Navamani is a pediatric physiotherapist who has 15 years of experience in promoting mobility and function in children with disabilities. She is currently leading the implementation of the Enabling Inclusion Program. Welcome you both. Mary, ma'am, please continue.
Thank you, Celine. So welcome, everyone. So we're pleased to welcome you to our last webinar of the series. So today is all about the environment. And okay, so we again would like to thank the Shastri Indo-Canadian Institute in Manipal for the funding for this lecture series. And this is a joint venture between Amar Seva Sangam and the University of Toronto. So the part one of our outline today is looking at the environment and inclusion. We will review the WHO's ICF and contextual factors. We'll look at the environmental barriers and facilitators. Then Navamani will review the UN's Convention of Rights of Persons with Disabilities and the Rights of Person with Disabilities Act. Then our part two will be looking at the enabling inclusion programs and environmental intervention. We'll look at the EI program's environmental assessment. We'll look at the interventions that we have for environmental barriers within our EI app. Then we'll look at the ICF-based functional skills evaluation and intervention. And finally, we'll present case studies from our community-based program in rural South India. So we'll be talking about all of our young people from age 0 all the way up to 18, and so with focusing on the early school age, early intervention, and early school age population. So just a quick review of the WHO's ICF, because this is where we will find the focus on the environment. So we all know that the ICF is a biopsychosocial model of health, and we are going to be applying it to child development. And for those who have followed us in our series, we've already reviewed the ICF and how it applies to any child, how it applies to any person, any child, and specifically with children who need early intervention and child rehab. And we have also previously covered the ICF and the F words that for childhood development, and how each ICF component domain has been linked to an F word for child development. And our focus today will be on the environmental factors, which is the equivalent of family for a young child, because the child's environment where they develop for the first few years of life is primarily at home with the family until they move on to spending more time at school and in the community. So just to a reminder how we look at both the ICF and the F words for child development. And we have previous webinars that have looked at that. And we have those lovely posters on the F words for child development. and translated into many different languages. So for those who aren't that familiar, you can look up the F words and the ICF, because there's a big focus on the environment for where the child develops and where the child participates and develops. So who is a child with a disability? Just to focus on who we are talking about today, they can be children with intellectual disability, physical disability, often cerebral palsy or any type of orthopedic impairment. Could be muscular dystrophy, spina bifida, could be speech and language impairment, hearing impairments, visual impairments, autism, could be emotional disturbances or learning disabilities, and there's many, many more. So I just want us to focus on who we are talking about today. So if we look at our ICF, the primary first focus is on body structure and function, activity, and participation. So it's really what we look at are how the child functions in their everyday life. We tended to focus more on the impairments, but now we are moving away from just focused on the impairment. We're looking at how the child functions and how the child is involved in everyday activities and participate in the participation. So this is who we're thinking about right now, is any child and how they're functioning in their everyday lives. So what is disability according to the WHO's? Disabilities, they will cover the impairments. And so the impairment is where there is a problem in the body function and structure. There's children who have activity limitation, so difficulty executing tasks or actions. So functional difficulties, and children who have participation restrictions, that have difficulty being involved in life situations and participating activities at home, school, or community. So look at body structure and function. Yes, they are the parts of the body. So we're all the basic functions and sensory impairments, range of motion, muscle tone, and so on. So, but we are going to be looking beyond this today. There's the activities domain of the ICF. It's the execution of all the tasks, all those tasks, daily tasks that are finishing in ing, walking, talking, eating, toileting, and so on. So our children have activity limitation in difficulty in function, executing those tasks or action. And then there's participation. Participation is being involved in meaningful life situations. So it's walking to play with friends, talking, but with families and peers. It's engaging in their community life, inclusion in life in school. So it's not just the basic function, but it has to be a meaningful life situation, something that's meaningful to the child. So when we look at contextual factors, this is where now we're narrowing down on what is interesting for us today, is the context, the environment in which the child develops. So we can have children living in urban areas, living in rural areas, anywhere you are around the world. What really has big impact on functioning is the context, the environment in which the child develops. And the context is not just the physical context. So that's why that's what we're focused on today. So we have addressed just now the body structure and function, the activities, the functional skills, participating in life situations. But what impacts all of that are the environment and also the personal factors. So these two components of the ICF are the contextual factors. And this is what really makes such a huge difference in how we approach our intervention. So now we look at what is disability. Disability is not just the impairments in the function and participation. Disability results from the interaction between the individual with the health condition, so our child with a disability, and the personal and environmental factors. So it's really the interaction between those factors. So if we backtrack here, it's the interaction between our context and the body structure and function, activity, and participation. So we're going to be looking at how that is so impactful. So first off, if we look at the personal factors of the ICF, we have to consider those factors as the internal factors. Most often things that you cannot change. So it's the child or the family or the parents or the constellation around the child. So the age of the child, the gender, the race. Then we look at the education, the profession. So that's not just the child, but it's child and family unit. We look at their past and current experiences, their upbringing, character, motivation, their likes or dislikes. So here we're talking not just the personal factors of the child, but also the whole family unit. So the social background, the coping styles, and factors that influence how disability is perceived by either the person, the child, or how disability is perceived by the family. So because we are talking about children here, it relates to both child and the parents. So those are the personal factors. And most oftentimes, these are things that you, in great part, cannot change. However, you may be able to change some of how they experience the disability to a certain extent. Now, finally, we look at our environmental factors. So the environmental factors have been found to have a major impact in how one can participate. So that's why today this is the focus of our talk. And we look at the different aspects of the environment because they can be recognized as barriers or facilitators to a child or a person's function and participation. So environmental factors are not just the physical environment. So yes, it can be the physical, the built environment, so but the accessibility, where they reside. It can also be the social factors, social support, peer support that they receive, the attitudes around disability. So their perceptions around disability, the stigma in the environment. It could be familial factors, how the family functions. It can be institutional, so the policies and availability of programs. So most often those environmental factors are things that we can change. And that's what's wonderful about environmental factors, is that they are changeable and they can greatly impact the person's function and participation. And we have to remember that aids, assistive devices, and adaptations are all part of the environmental factors, and they usually are facilitators. So we're going to be looking at that. I'm just adding here, this is not the ICF, but I'm just adding that for the young children, what also we need to keep in mind for the environment of the young child is what the WHO, UNICEF, and World Bank Group came out with recently in 2018 is the Nurturing Care Framework for Early Childhood Development. So it really frames the best practices for the child's environment in early childhood development, and includes nutrition, good health, early learning opportunities, safety and security, and responsive caregiving. So just the importance of that enriched environment and the nurturing for the child's proper development in those early years. So I just wanted to add that that is so important in what's being provided to the young child. So if we look here, this is the ICF framework. This is from a study that was done a few years ago. This is the ICF framework that has been drawn upon for any neurodevelopmental disorders. Could be cerebral palsy, autism, ADHD, and so on. And it looks at what within each domain, what is key. And I just highlighted here the environmental factors here once again, because to highlight the fact that we have for those children, the family, the peers, the social support that are important. It can be the adapted toys and again, the enriched environment. So it can even be the sounds, the light quality, could be the use of assistive technology, could be the attitudes of the society around the children. Again, the health, education, and social services that are adapted, and the policies. So this is what we're focused on today, is how we can intervene at this level for the benefit of improving function, participation, and quality of life. And that's the reference for this paper. So what are the environmental facilitators? So facilitators a factor can be a facilitator either by its absence or its presence. So let's look at that. Physical environments that are accessible, okay, that's a facilitator. The availability of relevant assistive technology, positive attitudes of people towards disability. Those are all facilitators which will enable function. Services, systems, and policies that aim to increase the involvement in everyday life. So the inclusion of children, adults in everyday life. So an absence of a factor that can be facilitating would be, for example, the absence of stigma, okay, or the absence of negative attitudes. So if we work towards trying to reduce the stigma, eliminate the stigma and the negative attitudes, that is facilitating for our people who we're talking about. So facilitators can either prevent an impairment or activity limitation from becoming a participation restriction. So if we facilitate function, we're going to facilitate participation in everyday life. So barriers, again, barriers can be either through their absence or their presence. So barriers are there often, they will be limiting function, they will be creating the disability. Okay, so we're talking about how the environment actually often creates the disability. So physical environments that are not accessible, that lack relevant assistive technology, the negative attitudes, all those are environmental barriers. The economical situation of a family, of the environment, can also be a barrier to function and participation. So we also have to think about the services, the systems, the policies that often either they're non-existent, they're not inclusive, and they hinder the involvement in everyday life or in the child attending school. So here's an example of how the ICF factors may be rated. I just took this from a study. So those we're looking at, these are the highlighted factors from the ICF under the environment. And each factor can be either a facilitator, or a barrier, depending on the setting. So for example, this one here, so societal attitudes are in this situation a great barrier, okay, if there are negative attitudes. At times, we have here that the design, constructions, and immediate family and friends are facilitators in this situation. So we have to actually look at each situation separately and be able to see, is it a barrier or a facilitator? So I will pass it on to Navamani, who will talk about the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. Navamani, my co-presenter. Is she there? If Navamani is not present.
Hello, yes, hello, Mari, can you hear me?
Yes, Navamani, you are there.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I had some internet issues, so
Okay. Okay, I'm just trying to find your video here.
Yeah, just 1 minute.
Okay.
Hello. Yeah.
Yes, I'm just.
Good morning, all. So environmental intervention. Environmental intervention in shorter version, it is adopting the environment so that to maximize the inclusion and participation of children and adults with disabilities. Here, we are working with the environment, means outside the child. So we as a professional may have some questions like, is it mandatory? Is it legally supported? Because when we are saying that modification of the environment, sometimes we may think that for one person, do we need to do these changes? So these are the questions may arise as a professional when you are working with the children with disabilities and when you are talking about the environmental intervention. I would say yes. It is not only legally supported, but it is also legally mandated. Here, I would like to bring two important legal documents which supports the environmental adaptations, environmental intervention. So the first one is the UNCRPD. It is the UN's Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disability. This is the one of the first convention based on the human rights model. It was adopted by the UN in the year 2006. Soon after, India has ratified this convention in the year 2007. Ratifying it means India has the obligation to follow the guidelines given in the convention. Next one, Mari. Next slide, Mari. Yeah. So this UN convention, even the definition given in the UN convention talks about the environmental barrier. It says, the person, when it defines the disability, it says, when the person with impairment interact with the various barriers like physical and the environmental and the attitudinal barrier that limits the participation of persons with disabilities. So here the convention puts equal weightage to the environmental barriers, like the impairment, the disability is defined as interaction of impairment when the person is interacting with the physical and the attitudinal barrier. Next slide. There are the first 8 principles given in the CRPD. The first one is respect for inherent dignity, individual autonomy, non-discrimination, full and effective participation and inclusion in society, respect for difference and acceptance of persons with disabilities, equality of opportunity, accessibility, equality between men and women, respect for the evolving capacities of children with disabilities, and respect for the right of children with disability to preserve their identities. These are the 8 guiding principles of the CRPD. Next, Marie. I would like to bring some of the important aspects of UNCRPD, which talks directly or indirectly about the environmental intervention. The first and foremost thing is the reasonable accommodation. What is reasonable accommodation? It is the necessary and appropriate modification and adjustment that promotes enjoyment or exercise of equal basis with others of all human rights and fundamental freedom by persons with disabilities, not imposing a disproportionate or undue burden. So reasonable accommodation means the necessary and appropriate modification and adjustment that promotes equal participation. The second one is the universal design, the design of products, environments, programs, and services to be usable by all people. So universal design, it is not only for persons with disability, but the design of the environment and the products, services, so that everyone can access without the need for adaptation or specialized design. Universal design does not exclude assistive devices for a particular group of persons with disabilities where there is needed. Yeah, next one. The other articles which talks about the environmental intervention are Article 5, which talks about the equality and non-discrimination. In order to promote equality and eliminate discrimination, state parties shall take all appropriate steps to ensure that reasonable accommodation is provided. So it talks directly about the environmental intervention. The next one is specific measures which are necessary to accelerate or achieve de facto equality of persons with disabilities shall not be considered discrimination under the terms of the present convention. So whatever the environmental intervention we are making, the reasonable accommodation given for the children and adults with disability should not be considered as an additional support. It is a reasonable accommodation which is necessary for the participation. Yeah, next slide. So Article 8 talks about the awareness raising, which is the to address the attitudinal barrier. So state parties undertake to adopt immediate, effective, and appropriate measures to raise awareness throughout the society, which includes at the family level regarding persons with disabilities, and to foster respect for the rights and dignity of persons with disabilities, to combat stereotypes, prejudices, and harmful practices relating to the persons with disabilities, including those based on sex and age in all areas of life, to promote awareness of the capabilities and contributions of persons with disabilities. Next, Marie. So within the awareness raising measures, it includes initiating and maintaining effective public awareness campaigns, which includes to nurture receptiveness of the rights of persons with disabilities, to promote positive perceptions and greater with disabilities, to promote recognition of the skills, merits, and abilities of persons with disabilities and of their contributions to the workplace and the labor market, fostering at all levels of the education system, including all children from an early age, an attitude of respect for the rights of persons with disabilities, encouraging all organs of the media to portray persons with disabilities in a manner consistent with the purpose of the present convention, promoting awareness training programs regarding persons with disabilities and the rights of persons with disabilities. Next. Article 9, which talks about the accessibility to enable persons with disabilities to live independently and participate fully in all aspects of life. State parties shall take appropriate measures to ensure to persons with disabilities access on an equal basis with others to the physical environment, to transportation, to information and communications, including information and communication technologies and systems, and to other facilities and services open or provided to the public, both in urban and rural areas. So this article talks directly about the accessibility, which is indirectly quoting the need for the environmental intervention. Next one. Accessibility. The other one is identification and elimination of barriers. These barriers, which shall include the identification and elimination of obstacles and barriers of accessibility, buildings, roads, transportation, and other indoor and outdoor facilities, including schools, housing, medical facilities, and workplaces, information, communication, and other services, including electronic services and emergency services. Accessibility measures to provide forms of live assistance and intermediaries, to promote other appropriate forms of assistance and support to persons with disability, to ensure their access to information, to promote access for persons with disabilities to new information and communication technologies and systems, to promote the design, development, production, and distribution of accessible information and communication technologies and systems. Next. Next, Marie. So now the other important legal framework which is in India is the RPDA Act, which is based on the UN CRPD. So which also talks about the accessibility and the environmental intervention. Next one. So the Rights of Persons with Disability Act, this aims to uphold the dignity of every person with disability in the society and prevent any form of discrimination, facilitates full acceptance of persons with disability and ensure full participation. It mandates the universal design, accessibility, and reasonable accommodation to facilitate full and effective participation of persons with disabilities. Next. So some of the important highlights of this RPDA Act, which supports the accessibility and the environmental intervention, are the reasonable accommodation. So chapter 3 of the chapter 3, which talks about education, section 16 talks about provide reasonable accommodation to the according to the individual requirements and provide necessary support, individualized or otherwise, in environments that maximize academic and social development consistent with the goal of full inclusion. Next, Mike. Chapter 4, which talks about skill development and employment, which is mostly for the adults, but we may know about this. So every government establishment shall provide reasonable accommodations and appropriate barrier-free and conducive environment to employees with disabilities. Chapter 5, which talks about social security, health, rehabilitation, and recreation. Section 29 talks about developing technology, assistive devices, and equipments to facilitate access and inclusion for persons with disabilities in recreational activities. Next. Section 40 of the RPDA Act talks about the accessibility. The central government shall, in consultation with Chief Commissioner, formulates rules for persons with disabilities, laying down the standards of accessibility for the physical environment, transportation, information and communications, including appropriate technologies and systems and other facilities and services provided to the public in rural and urban areas. Section 43 talks about the consumer goods. The appropriate government shall take measures to promote development, production, and distribution of universally designed consumer products and accessories for general use for persons with disabilities. So now we have seen the legal frame support, the legal mandatory for the environmental intervention. I'm going to explain how we are doing it in our program, in the Enabling Inclusion program. Next, Mari. The environmental barriers, we can classify or categorize environmental barriers into many categories, but in our program for our easy understanding and intervention, we have divided the barriers into 4 categories. The first one is attitudinal barrier, physical barrier, economical barrier, and the communication barrier. And this barrier exists at all levels, starting from the family, in the school, in the community, and wherever the place of participation, at everywhere. When you ask me which is the biggest barrier we face, is the attitudinal barrier. From the families, it is accepting the child's condition, accepting the intervention, accepting the physical environment if the reasonable accommodations or anything required for the child. It starts from there. In the school and the community, yes, it is why for this child, whether it is necessary or not. So we face a lot of attitudinal barrier. The second one is the physical barrier. We know 90% of our all built-in physical infrastructure are inaccessible. We also know even now, many households do not have individual toilets. With that, we have to work on the accessibility for persons with disability in the public places, even in the public toilets also. Economical barrier. I have put it as the biggest barrier because sometimes we work with the families, we make them understand about the needs of the child with disability. We are able to get success in the schools and the community, making them to understand the importance of environmental intervention. But money is very essential to do all the changes. So that is because sometimes it delays the process. Without any resources, we cannot do the changes. So economical is the biggest barrier to do all the environmental intervention. And the fourth one is the communication. It is not only the child's able to communicate with the family and the child, but also the generally losing the information which we all get through the other means. So these are the 4 main categories of barriers we have identified in our program. Yes, Mari, next one. Environmental intervention. Again, what are the things we do for the environmental intervention? For the physical intervention, we promote reasonable accommodation. We do individual assessment of children and try to put ramps, handbars, and accessible toilets. So physical environment is addressed in that way. The first, attitudinal barriers. In the individual level, at the family level, we do counseling to the parents. It may be at the different level by the rehab professionals or parent to parents. We also have parents advocacy group. So through parents advocacy group, we try to give or change the attitude. The other one is the awareness program. It is at the family, for the community, and at the school level. And the other one is the advocacy, and we go directly into the advocacy for that. And the third barrier is the economical barrier. For the reasonable accommodation, we organize funds or welfare schemes and benefits for the families. We do advocacy for the environmental reasonable accommodation in the common places, in the public places. And the fourth one is the communication. With respect to the communication, I feel like the awareness is the most important one, because many times we forget that people with disabilities, children with disabilities, don't get the general information we get. So it is just the consciousness we should have. So we work on the awareness area. and also for the communication, other communication methods like AAC and other communication methods.
So in order to have the environmental intervention, we had to bring about some changes in our Enabling Inclusion program in the EI app to fully have the assessment of the environment and also the intervention on the environment. So we also looked at the ICF and looked at what the ICF, how the ICF guides us. So that's why we have really developed the Enabling Inclusion app to have these assessments and intervention within the app, where we do look at every component of the ICF, and we have specific assessments and intervention looking at the environment. So this is just to highlight one of the assessments that we have within the app that looks at the environmental factors. So let's look at the environmental factors assessment that we use within the EI app, and it looks at home, family, and school. So I'm sharing with you some of the environmental factors assessment that we look at. And first we look at the family in the home. So we look at factors such as questions that we look at are the family's understanding about disability. And some of the options within the app are either they understand the medical condition, they understand the child's capacity, they expect for a cure, or they have over expectations from the child. So any of these are options that we may be able to indicate within the app. We look at families' understanding about the intervention. So understanding the process of the intervention, understanding the modified independence that's that the child is able to do according to the abilities of the child, their expectations for cure, their focus on walking, which is often a factor, and also their tendency to seek complementary, traditional, or alternative therapies. We look at, we see how they have human support for training or care within the home. If they have support available to train or to do the home programs of the child. Also, or whether or not there is not any support within the home to work on home programs, or if it's not required. We look at the parents' acceptance of the use of assistive devices and how their understanding of the use of assistive devices or their reluctance in accepting the use. So these are all options that we look at when we speak with the family, how things are at home. Then we look at whether or not they have resources, so financial resources for purchase or maintenance of assistive devices. If they can make resources available for purchase, or they resources available for maintenance or repair of assistive devices, or alternatively, if they're unable to purchase or to maintain their assistive devices. We look at the space to use the assistive devices within the home. If there's limited space, if either there is space or limited space, or they have opportunities for modification of their space. If they accept to modify their space to enable the child to use their assistive devices, or if the family does not accept to modify their space. So we developed what we thought were the various situations that might be occurring. We look at space, whether or not space modification is required to accommodate the child's condition within the home. We look at the physical accessibility in the home. Either it's completely accessible or partially accessible. We look at the opportunities to modify the home and whether or not the family accepts the modifications or does not accept. And we look at whether or not they have the resources for modifying their home for the physical accessibility. So here we're incorporating both attitudinal, economical factors, and the physical environment. Then we look at the school if the child is attending school, we also look at the environment in the school. Again, the similar types of questions or items that we want to look at is the accessibility of the school, and also the school management's accepting modifications or not. And we look at the whether or not resources are available for modification of the physical accessibility, and whether or not human support for training and care of the child is available at school to facilitate inclusion. Then we look at the peers' understanding of the child's condition and needs at school, whether they're cooperative or bullying. We look at the school staff's understanding of the condition, and whether or not they're addressing the child's learning needs or not. We look at the school and the education policies, whether or not they encourage the child's participation. And lastly, we look at transportation to get to school, and also for participation in activities in their communities. So that completes our environmental assessment within the home, school, and community. Of course, there's other items that are looked at, but these are the main questions that are being addressed. So I just wanted to indicate that there are participation and environment measures that exist and that are used. Some are more lengthy and at times would need adaptation to the context. So that's why we aren't using these per se at Amar, Seva, Sangam, but these are two measures. The young children's participation environmental measure and the one for children and youth. There can be found on the Can Child Center website. So I put them there because they are also well-known measures for child participation and environment, but they are more lengthy and would need adaptation to the context. So how do we use then the information that we get from our environmental assessment to guide the intervention in our community-based program? So if we look at the answers that we got from our environmental assessment, we identify various barriers that are present, either barriers within the family and home or barriers that are present within the school. So the way our app is designed is that we have identified the barriers, and that will lead us to goals that need to be, problems that need to be addressed. So for example, if I take that the family's attitude and understanding about the disability is a barrier, we will have a goal to work on this area by providing adequate information about the condition and also in a suitable format, understandable by the family. So we will also have organized focus group discussions, sometimes with peers. We have parent groups. We also have counseling support with the parents, parent groups to really work on understanding the condition, the disability, and also trying to work on the attitudinal barriers. If we look at the family needing help within the home, we try to work on organizing those tasks within the neighbors, the community, training a specific family member or person that's within their circle of care. So we really work on those specific barriers that have been identified. These are other environmental barriers that may be found as the family does not accept the use of assistive devices, or they don't have the resources available. So we facilitate families' acceptance of assistive devices through various means, to information on assistive devices and the benefits on child development of the use of assistive devices. We have videos. We organize peer meetings with other parents of children that use devices. We also work on facilitating resources for assistive devices, either through family contribution, government sources, donors, or other sources. We also look at the accessibility within the home if there's need for modifications. So we work with families to find suitable adaptations and that they will accept, and we facilitate those resources within their community. For the school, when the school is not accessible, we work with school management and the family to find suitable solutions and suitable adaptations, and also looking at the resources that are available for adapting the school environment. So everything is geared towards changing the environment to facilitate participation. Then when it comes to attitudinal barriers, within the school or within the peers at school, we have various interventions that are outlined in the app as steps to take. And for example, if it's a sensitization program that needs to be done for working with the child, we work with the school, we work with student mentors for the child with disability, and we can also request petitions to the district collector if there's specific needs. So with the school, we work with the family, the school management to identify persons that can be of a support. And we have periodic, regular sensitization programs within the school, awareness programs where we work with peers. And we can go back once a month to various schools to work on further awareness training. So everything that we do in terms of the environment is always geared to promoting inclusion and participation. So these are just a few of my pictures when I was at, it was Diwali at Amar Seva Sangam. So now, once that we've modified, adapted the environment, and worked at an environmental intervention, we also want to see, does that make a difference in the child's function? Are the child's functional skills changed by modifying the environment? So what is that functional progress? So we have an ICF-based functional skills evaluation. And we also use the WIFIM, which is the functional independence measure, as a parent feedback tool. So our ICF-based functional skills evaluation, which is again within the Enabling Inclusion app, has various domains that it looks at, because we do want to see, do our environmental modifications improve any of those daily life activities? So we look at feeding, bathing, toileting, dressing, brushing teeth, grooming. We look at the indoor mobility, outdoor mobility, and functional transfers. So if we're thinking of the child who may be not yet of school age, those are the functional skills that are the important ADL activities that are needed for a younger child prior to attending school. So let's look at how our app is designed to look at the level of independence in eating. So we have within the Enabling Inclusion app where we have different levels of independence in eating, where we identify where is that child placed right now within, is the child completely dependent for feeding and does not indicate hunger or thirst, or does indicate but needs to be fed, indicates hunger and thirst and eats food in small pieces, and so on, and minimum supervision or support needed, or complete independence. So just to give you a sense of the progression on a 5-point scale, And then that leads us to how can we adapt the environment to facilitate some of those functional skills. So making sure that the eating position is achieved and the materials used, or if the materials used are either not accessible, if there is appropriate position, but the materials are not accessible, if there's appropriate position, but the adaptations, and if adaptations have been tried, and then and so on, looking at whether or not the child needs adaptations for eating, whether it's sitting support or the plate, or where the child is positioned. So if everything, the environment has been adapted in order to provide the optimal position in which the child could feed themselves if they have the abilities. So we just try to see, is there anything that we can position or adapt to maximize the independence? When we look at bathing, I just want to show you a gradual progression of the level of independence in bathing, and how we look at the suitability of the environment in adaptations for bathing. So all of these are to identify first of all the independence, then the suitability of the environment, whether or not the bathing area is accessible or not, and whether or not there's materials that are needed to be adapted. And also something that's important is we look at the privacy for bathing. Do the parents and caregivers have understanding about the privacy of the child, because that's needed for bathing. That's often something that parents might think, okay, the child has a disability, privacy is not the utmost importance, but it is, as a person, as a human right. It's the privacy depending on the child's age and where the child is in their independence. So to be able to understand the privacy needed depending on age and the situation. Toileting. Again, we really want to identify the child's level of independence in toileting, in indicating need, attaining position, and cleaning self. We look at the suitability of the environment, and that this is an area that we often need to render the home to have an accessible toileting to meet the person's needs or the child's needs. So this is an area that we really often have interventions needed, and also privacy for toileting. Again, the understanding of the need for privacy, if it's possible, and if it is preferred for depending on the age of the child and the abilities. We look at dressing, upper body, lower body, and how can we facilitate the independence in dressing. And it could be adaptation of the clothing. It can be the positioning aids, how the child is dressing themselves. It could be the devices if they need some sitting support, and so on. So what can be adapted to facilitate independence in dressing? And again, we don't forget the privacy as the child gets older, and that's always something that we discuss with parents as a human right. Brushing teeth, and we go through all the steps, the material that are needed, the whole progression in independence of brushing, suitability of the environment, either the support, the adaptation of the materials, and we go step by step. The grooming, so combing hair, and so for the child to be able to feel like they have a self-esteem in grooming themselves and being able to be most independent in those skills. And again, it's all relevant to the child's age And as they get older into school age and adolescence, becomes very important. And if they have an accessible area and materials. Indoor mobility, very important. So we identify clearly the skill level in terms of indoor mobility. And it can be start by being carried. It can be being able to creep, crawl on the floor, or push in a wheelchair, or walking with support. It could be the use of assistive devices or self-propelling a wheelchair, or using any type of mobility device. It could even be a tricycle. And eventually the child being able to walk independently. And we look at the suitability of the environment indoors, so the home, whether or not it's any part of the environment is accessible to the child. So the home can be partially accessible or completely accessible. And whether or not the child has a need for assistive devices for use within the home. So if they have sometimes received the devices but need training, or they may have devices or not using them. So, and we look at to see why they're not using them. So this is a big focus of to try to promote independence within the home. Then we look at outdoor mobility. So the same type of progression, but in terms of the environment, we look at the places that the child and family would like to be going to within their community. And the key places where they would like to be able to go. So sometimes they might have, you know, one or two places that they enjoy going to that are accessible, but not all. And sometimes we work with the community to try to look at accessibility. And again, we look at the use of devices, whether or not they have and use their devices, they receive training, or there's other barriers to be using their devices, and maybe the stigma, the attitudinal factors within the family or within the community that makes that they're not using devices that they have. So this is a whole process of trying to develop independence in outdoor mobility. And lastly, functional transfers. How is the child transfers? Often, at times, child is lifted up and parents have back issues. And if the child is able to do standing transfers or transfer by self with minimum support, we work with the family to try to promote the child's independence in self-transferring. And we also look at the suitability of the environment, whether or not there's transfer adaptation or needs to purchase any types of devices that might facilitate your transfers. So the WeFIM is the functional independence measure that we use with family as a feedback tool within the app. So when we have worked with families on all of these functional skills and adapting the environment, we look at these various items with the family and ask them how they feel their child is now doing in these various areas. So those are all the domains of the WeFIM, which is a worldwide accepted tool. And so it looks at all self-care, mobility, but also there's the communication and social cognition items. Yeah, and it is, the WeFIM is scored according to the independence, the need for assistance, and helpers. So this is the outcome measure that we have within the app that looks at parent feedback on how their child is functionally independent. And we modify the environment to try to facilitate that independence. So now let's look at some of our case studies from the Enabling Inclusion program. Okay, so we have a few children to present to you, and I will just, yeah. So here we have Mahalingam, who's a 4-year-old boy. And the reason that we are following him is that he has limited hip joint mobility due to a poorly treated septic arthritis. So he has difficulty walking and squatting. So just to give you a bit of information about the family, is that the father is receiving treatment for mental illness, and mother is the only breadwinner, and she's a daily wage earner with a meager earning. So they have no toilet facilities in the home to train him to be independent in his toilet functioning. So this is an example of economical barriers for access. And that limited access is having an impact on his toileting needs and independence. So through parent group advocacy, the parent participating in an advocacy group, a petition was given to the district collector, and district collector responded that a grant was given under the individual toilet scheme, and a toilet was built for this family. So these are an example of the steps that were taken to be able to obtain funding under the toilet scheme, and the child has an accessible toilet that takes into account his limitations in difficulty in squatting, and we were able to develop independence in toileting for this child. Now let's look at one with attitudinal barriers within the school setting. So Abhinayasri is 11 years old, and she has an hearing impairment and has received cochlear implant. So the barrier is an attitudinal barrier in the school education. Because of her hearing impairment, she was treated as a special child. The staff in the school were not expecting her to learn or to participate in regular activities. So the intervention here to address that barrier was to counseling with the parents, and also discussion with the school management and the teachers. So her learning needs were able to be facilitated, and the outcome is that now there's really improved school inclusion after the discussion with school management, and also continuous support to the teachers for teaching and evaluating, to look at the various approaches to teaching, to expect her to learn and to participate in regular activities, but with proper accommodation and adaptations within the school setting. So she's a success in gradually breaking down the attitudinal barriers. But again, it requires continuous support. It's not a one-time visit, but it's a regular visit to consult with the teachers. Here we have a case of attitudinal barriers where it's acceptance by family members that is the environmental issue here. So we have Kevin, who's a 5-year-old boy with autism. So initially the mother was reluctant to accept the son's condition. So it was only the father that was bringing him over for therapy to the early intervention center. So the rehab team provided education, counseling, and guidance to develop the mother's motivation and confidence in her son's therapy program, and also his ability to change over time if the effort was given to working on the activities with him. So after 6 months of continuous effort with the mother, of bringing her in and getting her understanding of the situation and the need for intervention, she finally started accepting her son's condition and giving him training as suggested by the rehab team. So because we know that intervention within the home setting is important, And if the mother is the one that spends all day with the child within the home, if the father was bringing him for therapy, but then he goes to work during the day. So really important of engaging the mother. So the child's progress in self-care has improved tremendously with the mother's involvement, because self-care really requires throughout the day follow through on the recommendations. So that's our success story here. Again, it's continuous effort. It's gradual changes over time. So here we have our young man, Manikandam. He's 16 years old. He has spinal muscular dystrophy, and he lives in a smaller village. He's studying 10th standard. And his family is his mother, who works as a tailor, and his younger brother, who is in the 9th standard. So his initial functional level was that he needed assistance to come to sitting. He was able to sit for 2 hours when kept in a sitting position. However, transfers, indoor and outdoor mobility, he was supported and carried by the mother and the brother. So he is not able to ambulate and did not have a wheelchair, and had a home that was not accessible. So let's look at the intervention that was done with him, for him. So the environmental adaptations that were recommended were a handrail connecting the living room to the bathroom, so that he could get himself to the bathroom, a handrail on the toilet, and also leveling the floor to reach the bathroom, and the small ramp provided at the entrance for home accessibility. So looking at the functional progress that's been made through these environmental adaptations, now he's able to reach the toilet without support of the mother, with the help of the handrail. So this level of independence in toileting has really improved. He's able to maintain standing with the help of the handrail while bathing. Again, level of independence in bathing has gone up. And we're thinking, he's a young man, 16 years old. This is great that he's now independent for these skills. And now he has a wheelchair accessible home. He's able to reach outdoors and to enter indoors. He's got the freedom of movement in and out because of the home being made accessible. So if we look at now the leveling of the floor and the ramp handrail that's been installed going to the bathroom, and the toilet that he has to be able, and the handrail inside the toilet to facilitate his transfer. So he now has independence of movement within the home and also in and out of the home. So I just wanted to add to our case studies that about the parent advocacy group meetings that are really crucial in addressing attitudinal barriers of caregivers and discussing issues such as the use of wheelchairs, and also discussing home modifications versus use of public facilities for things like toilets, and also the need for further advocacy within their village, within their community, and within the school. So peer groups are really crucial to moving forward the environmental interventions. And we also have the community advocacy initiatives. So advocacy for access in public places. So they can be collective places, or they can be for specific locations. So, and we also look at addressing school management committees, and we motivate the caregivers and the staff to the importance of accessibility and inclusion. And lastly, probably aware, we also run 3 different types of awareness programs. And these awareness programs are designed, we have our 3 programs are community, women, and school awareness programs. So again, this is to disseminate knowledge, understanding of disability, to try to reduce stigma and attitudinal barriers, and also to try to promote inclusion within community and the school system. So on behalf of Navamani and from myself, we thank you for your attention, and we're going to welcome some questions or comments you may have. And these are Amar, Seva, Sangam, children and young people. And we will stop our share and welcome your questions. So we welcome right now any question, comments, sharing of maybe your experiences in various environmental interventions that you may have within your communities. And also, just so you know, I'm coming to you from Canada right now, and it's almost 3 a.m. for me, but this is an exciting topic we're talking about. So does everyone have positive experience? Oh, we have comment from Sentil. Very informative session, thank you. We tried to give you a mix of the background, the need for looking at the environment that are in legislation and at times followed to a certain extent, but there's still a long way to go. And that the environment is something that we can manipulate in many different ways to provide best function and participation. It's not just working on the impairments, it's working on the environment that often creates better and best outcomes.
Hi, Mary. Hi.
Yes, is
Can
that
you hear me?
Subulashmi?
Yeah,
Is this
I'm Subulakshmi.
Subu ma'am?
Yeah.
Subulashmi.
How are you, Mary?
I am fine, and you?
I'm fine. I'm fine. Very good informations, and you and Navamani.
Thank you.
Done well. Yeah, yeah. But I have a questions. I have a questions about the case studies of Mahalingam. First case studies, the septic
Yes.
arteries, he has a problem. So your intervention is like best. It's my opinion is give the Western toilet. Why they prefer for the Indian toilets? Because he has a problem, no septic arteries. He has a squatting problem, and he has some restrictions in the hip joints.
Yes, because he had a. I will let Navamani answer that.
Yes, Subulakshmi ma'am. Actually, initially we thought of Western toilet, but actually he is progressing well and he is able to squat with the Indian toilet without any adaptations. So we checked with our physiotherapist, checked that angle. Then only we fixed with the support of the family. Like family preferred this one, but actually we suggested. But before fixing, because it was just 3 months before this was fixed, so we sent our therapist to check whether he is able to able to squat and able to use. So in that angle only we chose the Indian toilet. The water facility for the Western toilet also, you need a different type of settings. So considering that and the family's priorities and checking the that boys, that is a first priority, but we checked and we chose the Indian toilet.
Thank you, Navamani ma'am. Thank you so much for your information.
Yeah, actually,
so many problems in our Indians because of they are not accepted their disabilities. So we have so many environmental factors there because of the economical conditions. They are not doing the adaptations and accessibilities. Nowadays, we are seeing the public also not accessibility for in transport. Navamani ma'am.
Yes. The thing why we brought this in the environmental intervention is we as a professionals should know that it is our duty and responsibility to facilitate the access and the intervention, because most of us we work with the child level. We are happy to do that one. We think that it is our work is done. We have to move beyond. It is very difficult because it's very easy. It is comparatively easier to work with the child with disability or an adult with disability, but changing the attitude, changing the environment is not as easy as we talk or what is in the case study. For each case study which was presented by Marie, we know like how much input goes on day one to day the end. It is almost 6 to 1 year of work went into each case study's success. Unless if we don't give that kind of push, we cannot bring models, because at this point it is not only for the intervention, this is required for the advocacy aspect also, because we have to show models that environmental intervention can improve the participation and the functional level of the child. So it is advocacy for the families as well as for the community. And we have to do these things initially for some time. So we have taken these initiatives as one of the advocacy aspect also to prove the efforts to the children and the families.
Yes, I know. I understand that because of the environmental factors is that because of the economical things like that. The accessibility is economical things.
I do understand, but we also in our program also we have some funds, and also we raise funds to do that advocacy, and also to do the access, and also we motivate the families also to do the accessibility component. So it can go only slow by slow. Gradually, at this point, our support is high. We expect that gradually the support will be low and the family support will be high. But yeah, it is purely towards advocacy, and we are doing it to prove that the children can be more independent and participation.
Okay, thank you, ma'am. Thank you.
And also, as therapists, as physiotherapists, or you can be a special educator, an OT, SLP, you can be a community rehab worker. If you just work on the impairments, on the range of motion, or on the ability to sit, or you can do NDT, or if you're only working on the child's body structure and function, or the function per se, but the environment is not accessible and you're not providing assistive devices and the attitudes are not changed, you will not improve participation in everyday life for that person or child. You need to have an environment that is a conducive environment to really promoting that independence. So as therapists, we need to work with the environment, and great things can happen when you work sometimes just with the environment, providing the proper support, the proper attitudes, and everything that's needed for independence. So we need to move beyond just fixing the child with the thinking we're fixing the child, working on the impairments, or just strictly the function itself. We want to move to participation, and for participation, we need an environment that is all inclusive. So my few words.
Yes, Mary, we have a more challenge as a therapist. We have a more challenge to do that. Yeah, we have a more challenges.
Yes. Thank you for the kind, I just want to take a chance to thank everyone in the kind comments there.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye-bye. Good night.
And I encourage, also we really welcome your feedback in the participation and you'll receive a participation certificate. And I think we've reached the end of our webinar, and we really thank you for joining us this morning and tonight.
Thanks.
And
madam.
yes, thank you all.